Thank you for joining us today for 10 Minutes with the Artist, an episodic series that explores the art practice and the professional vision that guides artists. On today's episode, we're very proud to have Musab Ataelmanan, who is completing a thesis at North Dakota State University in architecture. We invited him here today to speak about his research and the creation of artifacts in preparation of his defense. Catharsis of Grief, the Materiality of Loss is a multimedia artifact that invites participants to consider otherness. Instead of exploring the extremes of our existence, Musab considers the intersection of geography, culture, spirituality, and death as a way to recognize how we inhabit life and loss. I'm Anthony Ferris, and this is 10 Minutes with the Artist. So thank you, Musab, for joining us today for 10 Minutes with the Artist. So in your artifact, you talk a little bit about intersections. You talk about this as being sort of like a place in between. And I was curious if your work ever considers the opposite, which is like instead of being at an intersection and being in between, thinking about the overlap. I was curious if culture and geography and spirituality and all of those things can overlap, or do we have to constantly be moving back and forth?
I think generally they are always overlapping. It's a cyclical thing because you can't have one without the other in a way, especially nowadays in our world where there's so much depth and thickness to our history that it is all becoming one. So I think they generally always overlap. And when I talk about intersection or the in-between, I believe that I'm referencing the in-between of said overlapping, where you have two different sects that are opposite, that are, other, but they are one and the same in a way because humanity is shared. And beyond our manufactured almost polarities, we all strive for the same things in a way.
So death seems to me to be accessible, but also inconceivable, if that's possible. And your artifact talks about the Cora, which, as I understand it, is like much like I was talking about the intersection, is like a time in between, sort of like a non-being. And I was curious if that is death in the way that you're considering it, or if it's what is conceivable, which is that in my mind, I'm thinking about it like there's an object, that object exists, and then there's a time when that object comes into my mind, and then it exists in my mind, and then I'm able to take it with me. But there's like a moment between that moment, and that seems like non-being. If that makes sense, does the core to you represent death? Does it represent just something that is like in between conception?
That's a good question. I think the core for me is, like you said, that place in between conception, like what lies between life and death, what lies between past and present, what lies between here and there, that kind of link, yet it's also a moment within itself, is what the core is to me. I think the most notable example for that would be from a writing by Susan Cataldi, where she explores Merleau-Ponty's writing. And he has this concept of the flesh, and he talks about the reversibility of the flesh and how when you touch something, it is touching you back. And that touching that happens in between where it is, engaging in a reciprocal relationship with you, to me, that is the core. To me, that is, the thing that you don't think about, the thing that you don't conceive, but it's there, it's present. And to me, that's the in-between. It doesn't always have to lie in, a dichotomy or a duality or a polarity. It lies in the places you don't think about. And even in Timaeus, writing by Plato, he talks about it as the third kind. Um, and yeah, I consider it that. And in my work, I'm hoping to architecturally maybe perhaps manifest it, or at least a sliver of it, you know?
Well, speaking of architecture, um, this may be a cynical way of looking at architecture, but we only inhabit it for a short amount of time, whether or not it be simply passing through a space, or just being mortal, and we're not going to last as long as a building. So why do we still try to build under this premise of permanence?
Hmm. I think there's many different reasons for that, but the most, or the brightest one for me right now is the idea of, we like to be stable, and stability is a big part of us. It's almost in our biology, this kind of the idea of shelter and stability. And we don't consider what happens afterwards, death or whatever. And I think that is a bigger reason. But also, another side of it could be the idea of, lineage and what you leave behind and what you leave for your children, or, the next generation. And I think that is also an idea of permanence within architecture. And I think the last one, and I think this one could be slightly considered, more narcissistic, I guess. But I think in our humanity, we always want to be remembered. We always want to be here, even though we're not here anymore. And that's the idea of how do you leave your mark even after you die? Um, and I think architecture has a really great capacity for creating that.
There's this moment that got me thinking about this. I think it's maybe because of the core, maybe it's because of thinking about life. But I was wondering if maybe we are considering architecture in a different way now. We are building with a thoughtful approach to how everything sort of fits together. Maybe it's like sort of thinking about how things are constructed beforehand, and then we're putting them into place. Are we also thinking within the consideration of building and creating what it's going to be like to take it away? That we know that there will be a certain life of this, and so we've gotten to the place where the end is actually part of our consideration of creating in the first place.
Hmm. I don't know if we're quite there now. However, I do think it's extremely relevant, and it's a vital point of view because it allows you to consider all aspects of not just architecture but creation in general. Um, and with hopefully what I'm creating with my architecture, this idea of um, you know beginning and end, there and not there, is going to be really important, and really vital, because I think having an architecture that can exist yet can also exist by its non-existence. I know that sounds weird, but um, it almost leaves a mark in you, even though it's not there anymore, or even though it wasn't here. Um, is very much like our perception of loss. Um, and I don't necessarily reference death here, but I reference loss in general, because loss, can manifest itself in a plethora of different ways, from loss of connections, loss of life, uh, loss of material objects, loss of architecture. Um, yeah, so I think having that point of view in architecture be recreated and be lived in, yet lived through as well, is really important.
So why is lamenting, this almost sort of guttural sound, more relevant when understanding your artifact than, say, putting out a sign or putting a pair that's already decayed out?
I think the title of my project comes into play here, in this idea of grief, the catharsis of grief, and the materiality of losses plays a big part here, because lam- lamenting and crying and grieving is very internal. It's a very internal experience. It's part of us. And it's also, again, universal. And there's this very, understandable, directly understandable moment there where, you could hear the cries, you could hear the sorrow, you could hear the grief that's happening when a person, loses a loved one or loses something. And I think that within itself can translate into many different languages without necessarily having to be translated. Um, in my artifact, you hear so many different noises from, so many different cultures, and each and every single one of them represents the same thing, the idea of loss. However, they might not approach it the same way, and they might not think of, death as an end or death as a beginning, or, there's so many different interpretations of death. But the idea of sorrow and the idea of grief and the idea of loss is very much still a concrete, cornerstone to lamenting.
At the end of our discussion, we'd like to ask a few questions about your creative practice. So these are the tough ones. What time of day do you feel like you're most creative?
I'm extremely nocturnal. My productivity hits in after, and I'm embarrassed to admit it, but after 10 p.m. So, all-nighters are almost a casual thing at this point.
What do you listen to, or do you listen to music while you're making?
I do. However, music is just one part of it. I kind of have a broad spectrum where I listen to podcasts, I listen to, I watch YouTube videos, and I also love watching TV shows. I'm a chronic TV binger or self-proclaimed.
Are you reading anything right now?
Not related, not related to school. Most of it is related to school, but I generally do like to read. Currently, I'm reading on the work of John Haydock, and I'm reading about his Victim series, to be specific.
So each of you worked in a specific medium. What was the most challenging thing about working in your medium?
I think the most challenging thing about my medium is the fact that how is it a medium exactly? The tangible was very much, very light, with the creation of these veils that, conceal, that give you a space for your own, but are open to the world. That was meant to be extremely simple and easy to recreate. However, the most complex part is the idea of lamenting, and how are you able to convey emotion through just noise, and also lack of noise. So I think that's the most complex part. And how do you make, the participant feel like they're part of the process?
And then I guess my last question would be, what's next for you?
I was asked this recently, and I'm not exactly sure what the answer would be. Hopefully, I'm looking to go to New York, but again, I don't know what the future holds. And currently, my mantra is live day to day and see what happens. You never know.
Yeah. Better that you're saying live day to day instead of lament.
Yeah. I think that'll come in later.
Yeah. Well, Musab, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'd like to thank all of you all for your interest in the professional practice and creative explorations happening here at North Dakota State University. So thank you. And for everyone here at the Memorial Union Gallery, be creative.